For more than half a century, Big Boy 4014 existed in silence. 600 tons of steel rested beneath open skies, exposed to dust, rain, and time itself. To most visitors, it was just another relic, too large to ignore, yet too old to matter. The age of steam had ended, and with it, the belief that machines like this still had a future. But 4014 was never built to fade quietly. Even in stillness, its scale told a different story. Longer than a city block, heavier than most modern locomotives combined, it was a machine born during a moment when limits were meant to be broken. This was not preservation by design, it was survival by neglect. The giant remained only because dismantling it would have been harder than forgetting it. For decades, engineers walked past the locomotive with mixed emotions. Awe, yes, but also doubt. The systems were obsolete. The skills required to repair it were disappearing, and the cost of revival seemed impossible to justify. Many believed the Big Boy's story had already been written. Its final chapter sealed the moment its fire went cold. Yet history has a way of waiting. Beneath layers of rust and fading paint, Big Boy 4014 carried more than memories. It carried unfinished business. What no one could yet imagine was that this silent monument was only sleeping. And when the idea of revival finally surfaced, it would challenge not just engineering limits, but the very definition of what progress meant in a modern world. Big Boy 4014 was never meant to be elegant. It was designed to solve a brutal problem at a brutal time. In the early 1940s, America's railroads faced an unforgiving enemy: the Wasatch Mountains. Long, punishing grades consumed fuel, destroyed lesser engines, and slowed the flow of supplies when the nation could least afford delay. Union Pacific demanded a machine that could haul immense loads without helpers through thin air and extreme cold. Alco answered with something unprecedented. The 4884 wheel arrangement was not a technical curiosity. It was a declaration. 8 driving wheels in front, 8 more behind, all pushing against steel rails with raw force. This locomotive would not negotiate with gravity. It would overpower it. 25 Big Boys were built, each a product of wartime urgency and industrial confidence. They hauled thousands of tons, ammunition, machinery, food, cargo that fueled both the battlefield and the factories behind it. There was no margin for failure. If a train stalled on the grade, entire supply chains suffered. But power alone was not enough. Big Boy combined size with surprising balance. Its articulated frame allowed it to snake through mountain curves, while massive boilers produced steam at a rate few engines could match. Every rivet, every bearing served one purpose: relentless movement. These locomotives did not symbolize luxury or speed. They represented endurance. In an era defined by necessity, Big Boy 4014 stood as proof that engineering, when pushed by history, could become something almost mythic. Behind every giant machine stands an army of invisible hands. Big Boy 4014 was no exception. While its size captured headlines, its true strength came from the men who operated, maintained, and trusted it in the harshest conditions imaginable. Crews climbed aboard before dawn, their routines shaped by cold mornings, roaring fires, and relentless schedules. Engineers listened, not just with their ears, but with their bodies, feeling vibrations through the throttle, sensing pressure changes before gauges could react. Firemen fed the beast endlessly, shoveling coal with practiced rhythm, knowing that hesitation could mean a stalled train halfway up a mountain grade. Maintenance crews worked long after the locomotive returned to the yard. Grease, steam burns, and metal fatigue were constant companions. Bearings had to be inspected, rods aligned, valves adjusted. There were no shortcuts. A single overlooked flaw could turn thousands of tons into an uncontrollable force. Most of these men would never be remembered by name. Their work left no signatures, only performance. Yet their skills were passed down like an oral tradition. Learned through mentorship, repetition, and mistakes survived. Big Boy was as much a product of human judgment as mechanical design. When steam finally gave way to diesel, those skills began to disappear, shops fell quiet, tools were retired, and the men who once spoke the language of steam carried their knowledge into silence. Decades later, that lost expertise would become the greatest obstacle to Big Boy 4014's return. The machine had survived. The question was whether the human memory behind it still existed. For decades, the idea of reviving Big Boy 4014 surfaced only as a rumor. It appeared in conversations, faded into laughter, then disappeared again. The cost was enormous, the risk was reputational, and failure would be public. No modern railroad wanted to be remembered for destroying a legend in the name of nostalgia. Yet in the early 2010s, something shifted. Union Pacific began to see its history not as a burden, but as an asset. As steam faded further into memory, the absence itself became valuable. What if a living locomotive could do what museums never could? Make history move again? In 2013, the impossible became formal. A single agreement transferred 4014 from static display into Union Pacific's care. On paper, it was a trade. In reality, it was a responsibility measured in thousands of tons and millions of expectations. The railroad committed not just to restoration, but to operation, placing the big boy back on active rails. Skepticism followed immediately. Engineers questioned whether the boiler could ever pass modern inspections. Executives worried about liability. Historians feared irreversible damage. There were no guarantees, only deadlines and unknowns. But signatures were signed, hands were shaken, and the decision was sealed. Big Boy 4014 was no longer a monument. It was a project, a gamble. And once the paperwork dried, there was no turning back. The next challenge was not restoration, but movement. To revive the giant, they would first have to move it across an entire country. Moving Big Boy 4014 was not transportation, it was choreography. The locomotive had not rolled under its own power for more than 50 years, and every mile ahead represented a question without precedent. Weighing over 600 tons, the giant could not simply be lifted onto a flat car or pushed down the line without consequence. Engineers mapped a 390-mile route from California to Wyoming with obsessive care. Bridges were analyzed, curves measured, clearances rechecked. Temporary panel tracks were laid to ease the locomotive off its display site, inch by inch, as if waking a creature that might resist being disturbed. Once on the main line, modern diesel locomotives became its escorts. They pulled slowly, cautiously, stopping often for inspections. Bearings heated unexpectedly. Weather delayed progress. A derailed support truck halted the convoy entirely. Each setback reminded the crew that history does not move easily. But something else happened along the way. Word spread. Towns gathered. Families lined tracks with flags and cameras, waiting hours for a single moment as the giant passed. Elderly rail fans wept openly, seeing a machine they thought lost forever. Children stared upward, measuring themselves against its wheels. Big Boy 4014 was still silent, still cold. Yet as it crossed deserts and mountain passes, it no longer felt dead. The journey transformed it from an artifact into a national event. By the time it reached Cheyenne, Wyoming, the giant had already returned, at least in spirit. Now came the work that would decide whether the revival was possible at all. Before Big Boy 4014 could be rebuilt, its home had to be transformed. The historic shop in Cheyenne was never designed for a machine of this scale. Its ceilings were too low, its cranes too weak. Its layout belonged to another era, one that ended long before a 600-ton giant returned to claim the space. Demolition came first. False ceilings were torn away, sending decades of dust and insulation crashing to the floor. As light poured in through newly opened skylines, the true height of the locomotive revealed itself. The building had to grow, physically, just to contain the ambition of the project. At the heart of the transformation stood a new overhead crane, engineered to lift 40 tons in a single motion. Installing it required reinforcing walls, embedding steel beams, and recalculating loads throughout the structure. Each component weighed thousands of pounds, Yet precision mattered as much as strength. One misalignment could compromise everything below. As the crane rails slid into place, the shop changed character. What was once a storage space became a living workshop. Fresh paint, coated girders, new windows caught the light. Heavy tools gleamed under modern illumination. The building no longer felt abandoned. It felt prepared. This was more than renovation. It was a statement. Big Boy 4014 would not be restored with improvised solutions or half measures. The shop itself became part of the machine, a cathedral of steel built to resurrect another. With the space ready, the real challenge could finally begin, opening the heart of the giant. The boiler was the verdict. Everything else, wheels, rods, bearings, could be replaced or fabricated. But if the boiler failed, the project ended there. No amount of nostalgia could argue with physics or modern safety codes. Veteran boilermakers entered through narrow manways, crawling into darkness with flashlights strapped to their helmets. Inside, heat lingered even in cold air, and every sound echoed unnervingly. Ultrasonic probes pressed against steel walls, measuring thickness down to fractions of an inch. Areas worn thin by corrosion glowed red on digital screens, silent warnings from the past. Nearly 500 stay bolts had to be removed. Each one anchored the firebox to the outer shell, and each removal meant cutting, torching, and driving steel free by hand. The work was slow, exhausting, and unforgiving. Sweat pooled on steel plates, arms cramped in confined spaces. There was no room for error. New stay bolts were machined from modern, code-compliant steel, threaded and torqued into place with exacting precision. Every installation was inspected using dye-penetrant and magnetic testing. Results were logged carefully, not as paperwork, but as proof of survival. For apprentices, this was a rare education, work that no classroom could teach. For veterans, it was a return to a craft nearly lost. The boiler slowly regained its integrity, not through machines alone, but through patience and human resolve. Only after the last bolt was tested could the team move forward. The giant's heart had endured its first trial. The next would test its strength under pressure. Some of Big Boy 4014's most critical components were never meant to be replaced. The original leaf springs, forged in the 1940s, were designed to carry unimaginable weight while absorbing constant shock. Decades of stress had left them cracked and brittle, far beyond repair. The problem was simple and devastating. No modern supplier made anything like them. The size, strength, and geometry existed only on faded blueprints and in the memory of long-retired craftsmen. Buying replacements was impossible, so Union Pacific had to become the manufacturer. Metallurgists studied original Alco drawings, searching for intent rather than imitation. The goal was not to recreate the past, but to surpass it safely. Modern alloy steel offered strength unknown to wartime engineers, but it demanded new processes. Custom dies were built, furnaces were pushed to their limits. Each spring was forged, heat-treated, tempered, and stress-relieved by hand. Nothing was trusted without proof. Each finished spring faced load testing under crushing force, 18,000 pounds pressing downward. The steel bowed, held, and returned. One failure would have reset months of work. When the final spring passed inspection, relief swept the shop. This was not preservation, it was reinvention, guided by respect. Old designs met modern science, and for the first time, Big Boy 4014 stood on components that honored history while embracing the future. With the structure secure, attention returned to the heart of the machine. It was time to see whether the boiler could truly live again. Before fire could return, water had to speak first. Every opening in the boiler was sealed. The vessel was filled completely, eliminating air, the silent enemy of pressure testing. Gauges climbed slowly as inspectors watched in near silence. On the day of the test, pressure rose past levels the locomotive had not felt in decades. The needle crept beyond 375 pounds per square inch. Steel groaned softly. For a long moment nothing happened, then relief. No leaks, no distortion. The boiler had passed. The giant could breathe again, but the fire would be different this time. coal was gone. In its place came number 5 fuel oil, delivered through custom-forged pipes to a precision-engineered burner. Steam atomized the oil into a fine mist, creating controlled combustion where chaos once ruled. On April 9, 2019, the shop stood still. A single ignition signal, a pause, then flame. Orange light filled the firebox, metal expanded with deep resonant sounds, and vapor curled from the stack. After decades of silence, the locomotive spoke again, not with motion, but with heat. Days later, Big Boy 4014 moved under its own power. Slowly at first, cautiously, as if testing the world it had returned to. By May, it rolled across open plains, its presence pulling crowds from miles away. Cameras clicked, cheers echoed, the impossible had become visible. The giant was no longer a project, it was alive. Today, Big Boy 4014 moves across rails built for a future its designers never imagined. Modern signaling systems guide its path. Diesel locomotives share the network. Yet when the giant passes, time seems to bend. The sound of its whistle carries more than steam. It carries memory. This locomotive no longer exists to haul freight or conquer mountains. Its purpose has changed. Big Boy now serves as a living bridge between generations, reminding engineers, builders, and dreamers that progress does not require forgetting the past. It requires understanding it. In an age defined by automation, efficiency, and sustainability, the revival of a steam giant might seem contradictory, but Big Boy 4014 proves a deeper truth. Innovation is not always about replacing what came before. Sometimes it is about learning why it worked and why it mattered. The project did more than restore. Steel and machinery. It resurrected lost skills, revived craftsmanship, and reconnected people with the physical reality of engineering. Every bolt tightened and every mile traveled stands as proof that complexity and patience still have value. Some machines are built to move freight, others are built to move people. Big Boy 4014 does both, one with force, the other with meaning. It does not race toward the future. It rolls beside it, reminding us that even in a world of constant change, giants can return, not to dominate but to inspire.